Okay, perfect. Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon or whenever it is that you are watching this for our next workshop in the Hack the Curve hackathon program. Really excited to have all of you with us today. And the reason for that is because I have the opportunity to introduce to you one of the DMZ's esteemed entrepreneurs in residence, or EIRs, John. So John has recently joined the DMZ as one of our EIRs, and he's really brought a wealth of experience specifically on the enterprise B2B sales and marketing side of things. So as we were coming up with programming for the Hack the Curve program, we thought there would be some of you who may potentially be looking to validate your startup with a proof of concept or pilot at a large organization. So why not develop a workshop with an expert who's done many, many, many of these before, to guide you through the process. So just like with all of our sessions, we will be recording this and sending out the deck afterwards. And of course, please feel free to put any questions that you have in the YouTube comment section that we'll be asking throughout the presentation or at the end. Without any further ado, though, I would like to take the opportunity to introduce all of you to John, who will be taking us away. So John, thank you so much once again for joining us this afternoon, and the stage is yours.
Hey, thanks, Shane. Good afternoon, everyone. John Bodolai here. So I'm going to spend the next 45 minutes or so just sharing some thoughts, ideas, and sort of best practices I've learned over the years in terms of developing successful enterprise pilots with organizations. And yeah, hey, it's great. And I always learn from these things as well, too. So looking forward to hearing some comments and feedback. So just a quick background on myself. I've been selling in the B2B software space for a good 20 years. And I've worked sort of all spectrums of it. I recently was at a startup, Screen Dynamics, that I'm also an investor and a board member with. And I've also spent time with large organizations such as Workday. And currently I'm VP of sales at Carbon 60, which is a public-private cloud infrastructure provider. I've also worked in all industries. So what I'm going to share with you today, I've accumulated experience in both public sector, banking, manufacturing, healthcare, you name it. And I've also, in terms of organization size, anything from sold pilots and software applications to companies with $300 a month in recurring revenue, up to those that are $500,000 a month in monthly recurring revenue. So hopefully share a few things here to help you along. When Shane asked me to do this, it made me think a little bit a background of some of the examples or pilot customers that I've worked with over the years. And here's just a sample of them. Now, I'm not going to share everything on this call, but some of these were successful and some of them were not successful. And, so we'll leave out which ones were successful, which ones weren't. But I think the principles and the learnings from that are ones I'm hoping to share with you guys today. One thing that when I talk to the teams I work with, and I think about this myself, when I look at doing an enterprise pilot, I love this quote from Michael Jordan. I'm sure we're all missing basketball and any other sports right now in this situation, but I think this is very applicable. And talent wins games, but teamwork and intelligence wins championships. And when I think about all the companies I work with, typically the talent in this quote would be the product or service that you have. A lot of startups I work with and a lot of companies I work with just have phenomenal products that they're bringing to market. They're innovative, they're disruptive, they're really, really, really good. But the one thing when I think about it, it's not just enough to win based on that product. It's more the teamwork and the intelligence that's going to win the championships. And in this analogy, it's going to win the pilot. And that's what I encourage like the teams I work with to think about, I think about, and I'm hopefully going to encourage you to think about as we go through this here. So I've developed this very short framework, and hopefully simple framework in terms of developing an enterprise pilot and proof of concept. And it starts with, build your value proposition, select your pilot customers, how to properly position the pilot, and then fourth and most importantly, gain that commitment, and also talk about pricing today and how you price that. Okay. So when I go through this, I also think about like the guiding principles of a pilot and a proof of concept. And one of the things I always look for is what I first describe as mutual partnership. Early on in my career, I would have taken any pilot. I would have worked with any customer. You're probably, in a lot of cases, a startup or incubator company, and you're desperate for those first client successes. And I get that. You start getting in a situation, and anyone who's spent time or listened to you, you think is like, hey, that's a great success and a great accomplishment. I've gotten much more selective on who I work with. And one of the key things to me is it's got to be that mutual win-win. It's got to be something where we're both investing, we're both taking risk, and we're both seeing the sort of vision and the mutual benefit by that. And if it isn't, I walk. And I'm going to show you a framework for how to qualify and look into that, but that's really, really important. The second thing I look for, which is critical, is that executive sponsorship. I've been in a lot of situations where I'm engaging with a project manager, project team, even a director or VP level, and the pilot has not gone successfully because we haven't had the sponsorship of the executives. So I look for that. And it may be on the IT side, may also be on the business side, or both. And so making sure I've got that. I look at the other thing, and we'll talk about this more today, but minimizing risk is important. And what I mean by that is you've got to look in the eyes of your customer and like, how am I going to minimize their risk during this pilot or proof of concept? And when I think about risk, it's not just financial risk, like i.e. how much they're paying you. I also look at a lot of other things like security risk. Are they going to be exposed if they do a pilot with you, exposing their data? So you got to cover off that element of it. Reputational risk. If a CIO or a chief marketing officer were supporting you on a pilot, what's their reputational risk if you fail and not doing that project successfully? So I look at those things as well too. These statements number 3 and 4 are a little contrary, but it's important to balance them out. So while I'm trying to minimize their risk, I also have to make sure they have commitment and something at stake. And I'll go through a couple of examples where that's worked and hasn't worked, but you want to make sure that, as I said, nothing for free. They have to have something at risk or at stake in order to make that pilot a successful too. That goes along with point number 5, which is nothing for free. I hate to say this categorically, but I yet to see free pilots work successfully, and for a variety of reasons. So I'm not a big advocate of that. I think there should be some value for the service and cost recovery, at least in the pilots, and that's one of the things I look for. And again, it goes back to that mutual partnership. A good mutual partner will understand that you need to be paid for something. And finally, this is kind of always the drudgery and the hard part of it, but it is really important. Documenting scope, project plan, expectations, defining success, all these elements. There's a lot of error for mis-expectations during a pilot. You're conceptualizing product features, you're conceptualizing benefits, you're conceptualizing a lot of different things which a product or service can and can't do. And it's really important, not necessarily from a legal perspective. I'm not thinking about it so much from, as I said, a legal perspective, but more from managing the expectations and success of both parties as you go through a pilot. Okay. So I'm going to throw at you a hypothetical example, and I'm just going to reference this in several places during this presentation. But let's just say, for example, you've created a new cloud-based reporting tool that allows customers to easily extract data from their existing systems. It's much easier to use. they can create reports much easier, and they can distribute them across a company a lot easier than they can today. And let's just say, for example, that's the startup or the company you've created, and you're going to market and you're looking for pilot customers to help you with that. So let's start with that in terms of, okay, how do you build this value proposition so it's effective? So I'm going to first start with the wrong way. And a lot of times what I see entrepreneurs and people in the organization is they get way too much product focused, and at least initially. They start developing value propositions. I can see it. I look at their websites, I look at their marketing material, I look at a lot of things that they do. And the first thing is it tends to be very feature function based. They start sending out messages and communications, and it's got the words biggest, best, better, more efficient, more effective. And is using all that different lingo that sort of define the product a little bit better. And in this world, using the example I use about the cloud-based reporting tool, it may look something like this, where our cloud-based reporting tool improves operating efficiency, reduces time, generate new reports, makes coffee in the morning, and is easy to use with a new user interface. And what happens in a lot of cases, if you think about like a B2B customer, and I'm going to use the biggest, like a Royal Bank or Magna, there are literally 100 companies a month, if not a week, that are calling on those organizations using the same type of messaging, and it gets drowned out. And it's not very effective in terms of helping you position your pilot. That's sort of the discouraging news about that. The good news is a lot of these large companies, even the Magnas, Royal Banks, GEs of the world, they love to work with startup and innovative small companies that are adaptable, because it helps them become more innovative in their own sense. The key is finding out, okay, how you can position yourselves more effectively and sort of drown out the noise of all the other 100 companies that are trying to reach that same person that you are. And so the right way I always look at doing this is, first and foremost, is try to get industry specific and link to that industry benefits or pain. So if you're developing a solution that can span across industries, I'd still advocate focusing on one or two, maybe three in worst case scenario industries, and really get those, say healthcare, banking, and manufacturing as an example, or a service industry or government, and really get industry specific issues and pains and understand that, and the business problems. And also know what I call the known and unknown risk. Fear helps sell. And so being able to ultimately position where you say, hey, do you know, again, using this hypothetical example that we have, hey, do you know 15% of the reports that companies distribute have improper security access, or something along these lines, and being able to validate with third-party sources. And then the other thing I do is also link to the CEO and organizational objective. And I kind of use this thing as, you always got to ask the question why. So ultimately, you got to think about like positioning this so it links to that CEO or board's mandate. And it's either growing revenue, reducing expenses, it's increasing their sort of brand recognition or value in the market, or there's some sort of reputational organizational risk. So what you have to do is, if you're positioning a pilot, and I'll show you some examples, is tie your solution specifically back to those objectives. I'm going to just keep going, Shane, and pause to let you in once in a while if you have any questions. Okay, so how to do this? And I'm going to show a filtering technique, but first I'd focus on an industry. The second thing I would do is look at some third-party reports and industry trends or issues. I did a quick Google search on these two. Like if I wanted to know about, top issues facing healthcare organizations. Here's a Deloitte report. I did another quick Google search on top issues facing financial services organizations. I get a PricewaterhouseCoopers report. One that I really work with teams on to help is, and it's often overlooked, is the annual report in investor relations, particularly investor relations. Like if you go to a public company's website and you go to the investor relations section, and you can download these easy to read presentations that share with you the company strategy, the company issues, the company pains, highly, highly valuable source of information. If the company you're trying to pilot is not a public entity, I'll still go to their competitor sites of those that are public companies and look at their investor relations section, because it typically gives good industry knowledge and also may even give information on their competitors. Finally, if you're looking to build your own value proposition, I also will go look at your competitors, which I think many of you are already doing. Okay, so I've got the industry, I've got the major trends. Now I'm going to what I want to do is I actually want to go filter this list. So here's an example of this exact same exercise I went through at one of the companies I used to work with. And I apologize, a little bit busy slide, and we'll give the handouts, but you start with that industry qualification, which I talked about, which says which industries are the best fit for our pilots. Then what we did is we took a preliminary research and we identified 30 companies across the globe that would fit that profile potentially for a pilot. And that gave us, and then we spent time and we went through annual report, investor presentations, and other things. Then we came up with a detailed qualification list on that and narrowed that list down to a top 15 companies that we wanted to work with. And I'm going to show a template or a filter that we used in this particular example on how we narrow the selection down from 30 to 15. Then what we did is we built, like for each of those pilots, we developed a contact list of 12 to 15 contacts that we wanted to target within that company and reach out to have a discussion about doing a pilot. And then we developed an attack plan on that. So it's a lot of work, but what it helps do is it helps guarantee not just the success of your pilot, but also success of your company, because you're going to be able to replicate this to other organizations more effectively. So the notion is, if you're reaching out to 15 organizations to get a pilot, you're going to end up with hopefully being successful in gaining 2 or 3 of those as initial pilots, and then the rest you've developed a good foundation to sell to as what I call regular customers. Okay, so how do you narrow that down from 30 to 15? We developed specific qualification criteria for each of those accounts. And in this example, we selected so there was 10 qualification criteria. We looked at the revenue of the organization. We wanted to just deal with large enterprise customers. We looked at the senior leadership team. Was there a new CEO and executive leadership team in there? Were they early adopters? Were they change agents? Or was it kind of just like a status quo industry? We also looked within that, the senior sales and marketing leadership. We were targeting chief marketing officers, chief revenue officers. So same thing, we were looking for those executive sponsors that were relatively new to the organization or brought in to change and shake things up. And that's who became a better target for us versus somebody who's been there 20, 30 years, and is probably heading toward the retirement door and would not be interested in trying an innovative new product. And then we looked at criteria specific to the products we sold. Like in this case, it was channel size, channel type, average sales price, units, discounts. And then we came up, what's their promotional spend for this. This is just an illustrative example, but the point is you want to get a list of your target prospects down to a list of targeted pilots. And whatever criteria best suits you, you'll need to go through that exercise and determine. Okay. So now that you've got this, you know the industry, you know the target list of customers, you're starting to understand, going through the different examples of, what are some of these company specific issues, industry issues. Then you want to do the linkage, right? So how do you position the pilot? I've already described number 1 and 2 on this list, which is you're linking to the industry benefits or pains, and you link to that CEO or organizational goals. And that's important. So, you want to start positioning and saying, hey, an example I use, you're saying you might be engaging with, say, a manager level, and they're saying, hey, we need a new reporting tool. And the question I always ask is why? So why do you need a new reporting tool? It's because our management team is not getting effective reports. Okay, why is that? What are they looking for? Well, they're not able, they're always constantly looking for new information, and we're not able to satisfy them that. Why is that? And you get up to the point where you're going to say in a banking sector, it's, well, our CMO wants to open 100 new branches in Western Canada this year, and is trying to determine which locations and where we have our best opportunity for growth, and they're not able to determine that. And then you want to be able to go in and position that pilot specifically to solve that particular problem. So that's what you're trying to do with number 1 and 2. And with number 3 is you're demonstrating then that knowledge of that company you're targeting. Number 4, 5, and 6 are what I say ways of differentiating yourself from the noise. One is, I call it being professionally disruptive. So this, how do I describe to some people? Don't poke their eyes out with, like telling them they do things poorly and you suck. But it's more of saying, hey, you're not doing things optimally and the way you can be doing things, and I want to show you how. And one of the best ways of doing that is also referencing their competitors. If I was, say, targeting Royal Bank, I might share with them, hey, I noticed BMO's operating efficiency ratio is better than Royal's, and I've seen some things that your CEO is looking to do to improve the operational efficiency, and we can help with that, right? So referencing their competitors is a very powerful way of getting attentions. And the other one is, kind of this, what I call, I know something you don't. I know something about your competitors. I know something about operating efficiency, and subtly implying that you need to be engaged with me and talk to me because I'm in a position to be able to help you. So I look for things like that again, help differentiate and help position the pilot with the customer. I got a couple of examples here to share, and this is hypothetical. So as an example, let's say I was targeting Magna, and I was going after them, very large, successful automotive parts manufacturer based in Aurora, Ontario. If I went to their investor relations section and looked at, some investor presentations, I can see some really good gold in some of this data here, like their experience, higher launch costs, inefficiencies of new facilities are impacting their margins, lower production volumes on key programs, so I'd want to understand that, are impacting their margins. And then I look at their growth and what they're saying here in this other slide. So strong growth expected in Asia, lightweight technology outgrowing the market, in these areas. And so what I do is I dig deep into this. And so when I'm then targeting Magna and I'm going after them, my message, instead of saying, hey, I've got a bigger, better, faster reporting tool that can help you, you're referencing automotive manufacturers' ability to assess their own internal capabilities around lightweight technology, such as hot stamping, are negatively impacting ability to grow. We can help you achieve this by implementing our solution and achieving this goal centered around this. And so I might be targeting both the business side of Magna as well as the IT side of Magna to help implement this change and secure this pilot. This is an actual example we did, which I thought was pretty cool. Several years ago, we were targeting Polaris Industries, who make ATVs, snowmobiles, and other personal vehicles. And this was an idea one of my employees had, is we actually did a survey. So they sell to dealers who then sell to the end use consumers. And so what we did is we created a survey. So before we went and approached them about Polaris, about doing a pilot, we actually did a survey to their dealers across North America, sample size, and we found certain information on how Polaris was working with those dealers. And then we fed that back to them. So, and this is a hypothetical example, but in this case, I would, if I had a new web-based, cloud-based reporting tool, you may survey their dealers and ask them, what kind of information do you get from Polaris? How does it work? Where do you find you get good information, and where do you not get good information? And then I would feed that back to them. And I would ask, when I was surveying the dealers, I would ask the dealers how Polaris's competitors do relative to Polaris in that same area. And that's absolutely great information to then surface back to Polaris and saying, hey, we surveyed your dealers, which gives you creds because you spent the time to do that. And in this case, Polaris was super impressed. They go, you actually did that? You went out and learned about our dealers rather than just calling me blindly and not knowing me about my business. So they were super impressed and gave us the time of day for doing that. And then you're able to give them some, again, going back to that concept of using their competitors to create a little bit of fear and tell them something they don't know. We were able to share with them something that their competitors were doing that they weren't aware that they, or how they were doing versus their competitors.
And so, sorry to cut things off, John, but we have a question from the audience. So their question is around the amount of time you should spend actually, researching and looking into a pilot customer. And the reason why they're asking this is they've gotten to the problem in the past of not knowing when kind of enough is enough and when to stop doing research and to actually act or execute.
Yeah, great question. And of course, it's one of those depends. All the steps that I've advocated to this point are close to steps you should be looking at doing outside of a pilot. Like you're targeting a specific industry, you're targeting your ideal customer profiles, you're going through that exercise. You have a lens of a pilot right now, but it's also something you should be doing for your business in general. So up to this point, the honest answer is you're probably going to spend, if you haven't already, and a lot of you probably already have, is several months coming up with this information. You're knowing the industry trends, so at this point, we have just started like identifying those 15 or so pilots we're going to go after. And then if your question is, how much time should you spend on each of the pilots, then I think it's basically, dependent on the situation. Like you're going to be starting to engage with them. And then what I would do is I would go back to those guiding principles and saying, okay, do I have, and the big one for me is the sort of a mutual executive sponsorship. And if I don't have that, I would walk away. I would either find it or walk away. And so in that case, sorry, I'm being a little bit long-winded and hopefully answering the question, but it's, if I didn't have that executive sponsorship, I'd either get it or move on. I would not invest in actually doing the pilot.
And that's actually a good question that brings me up to a point that I've definitely seen come up as a frustration for a lot of the founders that we work with at the DMZ, where the supposed champion or the point of contact that you're talking with is blocking that connection to the key decision maker, whether it's the CEO, the CMO, whoever it is. And they could be blocking the introduction for a wide variety of different reasons, but before kind of just saying, hey, look, I don't have executive sponsorship because of, X, Y, or Z, what have you done to try and mitigate that issue or get over that hump if you do find yourself being blocked, but not to the point yet where you've decided to just say, hey, this isn't worth it for me?
Yeah, fantastic question. I love that question. So the first thing is you've got to build. So let's assume, for example, you're dealing with a manager or director level, and they're supportive in general, like they like the idea, and you're either engaging in a pilot or you're starting to talk about a pilot, but they're blocking you, and they're saying we're not going to go to that step. I have a pretty candid conversation with them at that point and saying, hey, Susan, I like working with you. I think we both see the benefits on this. We're both investing resources in this project, in this pilot, and I would articulate what those would be from both sides of the organization. It's important for me to then say, I at least want to have a discussion which you can facilitate with the executive sponsor to just touch base and ensure this aligns with their priorities, right? And how I sort of approach it is, say Susan's the project lead on this, is, hey Susan, we both want to do this for our benefit, and I'd like you to sponsor even what I call a check-in call. So I don't need a long meeting or whatnot, but I want to at least check in with the CIO or the SVP and say, obviously introduce who we are and what we do, get their thoughts on it, and just say, hey, are you supportive of this pilot project, right? And start with that. And if you can't get that, then I would probably walk. Like, I think, if Susan can't sort of help you understand or see the value in terms of doing that, then you're probably not going to be successful anyways, despite the outcome, right? And what I found a lot of times is, because when you get into a pilot, there's always sort of could be changes in scope, changes in definitions of success, and things of that nature, where you need to rely on them for additional support. And if I can't get that up front, it's probably not a good place to be. And there's lots, I'm happy to get into it more if there's more discussion, but there's lots of effective ways to directly or indirectly make sure you get that sponsorship.
Okay, got it. Thanks, John. And as a follow-up to that question, that's more related to kind of identifying that perfect or ideal fit for a pilot or POC, when you are a smaller organization, so let's just say it's the founding team, how do you advise targeting a potential business? Do you suggest that a smaller team, so a startup, go after a small to medium business first to prove it out and then eventually go to a larger enterprise? Or would you suggest kind of starting off with that larger enterprise and then going downstream from there as you are in this pilot proof of concept phase?
Yeah, great question. And to be honest, there's no right answer to that. I've seen both. It depends on, how do I describe it? It depends on your resources and your, what I call, product maturity, and your honest, so resources, product maturity, and how would I describe it is your strength of conviction, your honest strength of conviction of your chances of success. So let me give an example of that last point. If I was still in a very early stage and I honestly didn't know the pilot outcomes because our product variability was high and we were still developing and learning, then I probably wouldn't want to sort of, how do I say it, waste that opportunity on a Royal Bank or Magna, and I would pick a smaller organization. If I knew that and so if you're in sort of that market discovery or product discovery, then I would stay smaller. If I was in a situation where I was strong in my convictions about the outcome, the ROI it would generate, the success it would generate, then I would go for the larger enterprise.
Yeah, and I would just have to echo and agree that sentiment. I think everyone wants to get IBM, Microsoft, Apple. These are really marquee names that if you have these as customers on your slide deck, it's definitely going to make people pay attention. But as John mentioned, you have to think about the resources that you have. So if you are looking to work with RBC, even to do a pilot with RBC, they're going to put you through a pretty intensive audit. So, will you have all of those check boxes done for somebody who isn't as concerned with that? So, it's really making sure that it makes sense, not only for the customer, but for you yourself, where if Amazon wanted to do 1,000 employee pilot, would you be even able to handle that? Where if Amazon employs 300,000 people, 1,000 people to them is relatively small sample size. So that's what they see as a pilot. But a pilot for you might be 10, 12, 15 people. So it really depends.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Shane. Like all great points, because I think about, and you're right. It's not just it's not just the product. It's like the resources on your own organization, and yeah, even like dealing with some of these large companies, it's procurement. You could have a resource just managing procurement. I've seen some complexities, ones where there's a third party partner involved as well too, so that can get challenging. And another big one is on the resourcing side is the change management, the training, and sort of the support that goes on with the pilot. And I wouldn't underestimate that, because you want it to be a success and you want to be able to dedicate the resources. So pick your spots. To give an example, at Screen Dynamics, where I was recently, I was a brand new startup. I developed this strategy. I called it crawl, walk, and run. So we went after the automotive sector. And quite honestly, at first, we were just doing pilots and selling to small automotive dealerships, because I think that's all that we could handle from a resourcing perspective. And we were still proving out some of the, market concepts that we were dealing with. So then we went from crawl to walk, which was the automotive buying groups, where these were organizations that had 10, 20, 50 automotive dealerships in their portfolio. So then we would go to that. And then the run strategy was the OEMs, the Hondas and Volkswagens of the world. And that was our sort of intentional crawl, walk, run exercise. And that was strictly based on the financial capital we had in the company and the resources we had. And so, I would think about it from that perspective, and along the lines of what Shane was referencing. All right, I'll move on here. Okay, so you've just walked you through that. So we've developed our value proposition with a view of mind of pilots. We filtered our pilot customers, and we started to position them and again around those business messages and linking to that organization's priorities and concerns. Now, I'm not going to get into here like how per se you reach out to prospects, like what are the marketing channels you're using to that, whether it's your network or email or other ways. We can leave that a subject for another day. I'm just going to talk about here, some of the things that I would look for. Again, okay, assuming that I've engaged with this company, there's some interest, we've uncovered some need, some of the things we looked at. And some of this we've already talked about, but I'm just trying to give you guys a framework for this. One is that executive sponsorship. And I think there were some really good questions around that. And again, I don't need the executive sponsors to be, actively engaged in that pilot, but they should be aware, and I should be able to, or the project team should be able to engage and keep them updated on what's going on and then what's going to happen once the pilot is over with, and what happens next. But I definitely want that executive sponsorship. I've talked about this before, but just minimize their risk. And again, I think about that because I think a lot of times people think it's just financial risk. Oh, if I give this away at a low cost, they'll do business with me. And that's inaccurate. When you're looking at that company, even take that hypothetical example, Susan, the director, who's interested, she has a reputational risk. Like if this pilot is not successful, what happens to Susan? Does she look good? Does she look bad in the organization? Does she look good because she tried a new innovative thing, or she look bad because the project was a failure, right? So you got to just think about that in terms of her risk and how protect her reputation, using my hypothetical example. I think about, obviously, security is another, and privacy are huge considerations. I've seen a lot of cases where there's interest in a lot of fronts of moving forward on a pilot, but they can't give you access to, let's say that reporting tool is an example. How do they give a small company access to that data without jeopardizing, there's security regulators as an example, right? So it's important to think through those things, whether you anonymize the data or whatnot, but just think that through. Commitment, we talked about. We'll go through that a little bit, and I got a little bit of a framework. And again, document. I think it's super important, it sounds like sort of table stakes, but it's something really important to do as you go through this. I'll just leave this for the group. I won't go through this in detail, but this is just, if I was documenting it, here's 6 different categories I'd look at. We've talked about all of them, but I think the one thing I always think about is always in correspondence, and you're sending messages, refreshing, is constantly remind them of the purpose and goals of the pilot. Like, you're trying to solve a business problem for them, and just constantly, because that keeps their attention on the ball, right? They may have 50 or 60 different projects they're working on at one time. You want them to constantly realize why that's important. And then the other one is number 6, get into a habit of, there should be, whether it's a steering committee, and that's a great way, by the way, to get an executive sponsor involved. We did one at GE where we get the project team always engaged, and we kind of get into the weeds of what we were doing and the success and fixing different features and functions and that. And then once in a while, we would get a project steering committee and call them together with the executives and just give them a status update. And again, that's a great way to sort of keep visibility of your project at the senior levels. Price, I get this question a lot, and so I'll cover this briefly in a slide, and we can spend more time discussing this. But a lot of times people think, hey, I'll just give a pilot away for free and it'll prove its success. I was at this company where we gave away the implementation for free, and it was a transaction-based model. And what we found is customers just didn't engage in the pilot and didn't implement. Then I decided, okay, I'm going to start charging implementation fees and something up front. And then I started asking for some minimum commitments. And that changed. We did fewer pilots, but they were much more successful. And so some sort of thoughts and lessons learned that I've had over the years in terms of pricing and other sort of what I call negotiated terms considerations is even if you're going to discount, and I get why people do that, obviously I've done that, is you still want to always constantly remind them of the full value early. So, maybe a case where you're saying, hey, this is worth $1.50 per user, and that's what the value is. That's what competitors charge. That's the economic value of that product. So even if I'm going to give it to you for 50 cents per user, I want to constantly remind them of what that value is. The second point I got here is between CapEx and OpEx. So my thought on this one always is every customer tends to be different on a pilot. So I would not say one model is better than the other. What I do is I ask the question. So in some cases, people have CapEx money to spend. In other cases, OpEx. They're able to spend OpEx. So just understand the question or ask the question to your prospect or pilot, because you may find it more favorable to structure one way or the other for them. Generally speaking, say in a public sector, they may tend to have more CapEx. And in other situations, like a business, they'll want to sort of framed as more of an OpEx spend. But again, I would be asking the question to each one of your prospects because it's different. I do like to get upfront setup or implementation fees. And again, whether you collect that upfront and it can be discounted, you spread it over the term, you do it on milestones, or you do it at, once you go live and you charge them for some implementation fees. I'm always a favor of collecting something up front. And again, it just goes back to that commitment. Like I want them to have something at risk, something at stake. And I find this is an effective way of doing that. I generally have found, and again, experience makes it so you can generalize these things. And again, it's not universal, but when you charge no implementation fees, it kind of lessens the value of your offering.
Yeah, and so I'm gonna jump in here, John, with something that I've seen kind of a lot of DMZ companies struggle with, especially some of our earlier folks. So I definitely agree with you that nothing for free, trying to get some level of buy-in, skin in the game, so to speak. But I've seen a lot of our companies struggle with the kind of the challenge of, well, we're going to be your first customer, so as your first customer, we're kind of doing you a favor, so you should do us a favor, or no one's really used this before, so we should really get it for free, and then you can kind of charge everyone else. How have you gotten around this obstacle or this barrier that sometimes gets placed just to see if people can get it for free?
Yeah, great question. I tend to be just direct with them and say, if I give it to you free, you've got no commitment into this. There's no incentive for you to make this pilot a success. And I want to hold your feet to the fire just as much as you're going to hold my feet to the fire. And so my messaging would go along those lines. Yes, I'm willing to change product scope for you, willing to discount that, willing to do a number of different things because I do need you as a pilot customer. But at the same time, I would say this a little bit more eloquently, but I can do free with anybody. Mm-hmm. Is how I would have that discussion with them and say, and unless you're willing to see some value for our services, and maybe it's not a good fit. And you'd be surprised. And by the way, I've had customers walk and say, okay, that's fine. And I understand that. And that's a hard sort of pill to swallow sometimes. But also, I think in my experience, most companies would, if they really like what you've got and you're going to that, I can help you solve this business problem. And I guess I would go back to that, Shane, too, is I would go back to, okay, obviously we're not in alignment with how this is going to help your business, right? And okay, maybe we're not seeing this well enough. Maybe I'm not seeing this well enough, and try to go back to that point, because ultimately, if they can't see the value and like they're not, how do I describe it? I've seen those early adopter pilots that, and over time you get to see the sign really clearly. They want you to be successful. They want you to make money. They want you to, work with them. They see the value in what you're doing, and all of a sudden you get locked in with those types of people. And it's hard. And I get wholeheartedly that it's not a perfect world, but you look for those people that see that, and they'll want to be the ones that give you a fair and reasonable return for what you're doing. So.
Okay. And as a follow-up question to that, you know, I guess it's almost a two-parter of, is there ever a point where it is potentially worth it to do a free pilot? And I'm thinking of, we have these AI companies who just really need data. So the pilot is less about, the money, and it's more just about ingesting the data that the organization they're trying to work with has. And then on the flip side, let's pretend the customer you're talking to, isn't in a position right now, whether it's like budget cycle, obviously corona has affected a lot of companies, or you're working with a group, such as the government or not for profit, where they might not necessarily have as much money as private institutions. Does it make sense to explore a free pilot or some type of alternative method of transaction in those scenarios?
Oh yeah, great question. So I'll do. Sorry, the first one was around.
Is it ever worth it if there's yeah,
and consuming the data. Yeah, and again, I love to be proven wrong. I generally would not do a free pilot, and that's just my experience in the market. I would at least I look for something, and I got a few other examples. In terms of what to look for, but generally speaking, there should be some compensation for that, and it's only so that put it this way: if it weren't financial, what's the other commitment they're going to provide to you? And I look for things like, by the way, also in addition, not just free, or not just compensation, but things like references, case studies. It's not okay just for them to say, I'm going to be a reference for you. You may take a step further and say, okay, the more I discount or the more I'm going to do for you, if we do these things, you'll agree to do a case study. You'll agree that I can, post your name on our website, and those sorts of things. So just being a little bit more specific than saying you're just going to be a reference for me. But in terms of, I would still sort of advocate, and again, this is debatable, but just in my experience, I wouldn't do free. In terms of, COVID-19 situation and government cycles, I advocate more, let's defer versus free. So in other words, it may look like, okay, we're in April here. Governments have just started their fiscal years. It's the end of March. Hey, I get that, maybe we're going to defer things, but make a payment due upon successful completion of the pilot, defer 90 days from now, 120 days from now, just something to, again, I'm still looking for some way I can get them committed, where there's some pain on them if this pilot is not a success. And I'd always advocate for that. And again, just you can be creative, you can be flexible given the customer's situation, but just the question again I would ask is, how are you gaining their commitment? And if you've got a good answer to that in your own mind, then I'd say proceed.
Okay. And so just being mindful of time, I'm not sure if there's any slides that you still have left that we want to go through, John, but just a quick follow up, or let me finish it off and then we'll do the follow up from there.
Yeah, no, I'll just look at this term. The only point, just a quick point on that. I see sometimes people do pilots that are too short. It's based on basically go live and then like a testing period almost. Just make sure that you and the prospect work through, and it should be tight, like should be enough runway so you can see benefits realization. Shane, you mentioned this part in terms like change management training. I tend to see training and change management underestimated. Like that example, okay, if you had to light up 1,000 Amazon users as an example, who's going to train them, how you're going to train them, and make sure you pay attention to that because you want adoption for that. Um, and then sometimes I look at determining, okay, what would be pricing after the pilot. So just be mindful for time. That's it. This a good quote I look at from Henry Ford, very applicable in this case. Like, hey, pilot's great, and I see that as a great beginning in terms of coming together, keeping together while you negotiate the pilot and getting it started is good. And then ultimately, you want to get to where you're working really closely with a collaborative partner where there's mutual success. And I'll end it there, Shane.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, John. So a follow-up question from the one on pilots is, if you are working with an organization, once again, whether it's a not-for-profit or government entity, where the pilot is funded by a grant, would you look at that grant as quote unquote revenue if, it's not the organization paying for the pilot, but it's this third party?
Yes, I would, because you're being compensated, number one, and number two is, I guess, that public sector organization can choose where they spend that grant money ultimately. So if they're spending it with you, that's, to me, would signify a good, strong commitment.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, John. And I guess just one last question that I always, think about and I always encourage is, what are your thoughts on setting up kind of key metrics or kind of points where if the pilot achieves this, we just roll into the full contract? Have you seen a lot of pilots that are designed like this, or do you see there being a pilot period, a kind of break, pause, reflection, and then a full contract, or is it a combination of the two?
Yeah. Oh, I love that question, Shane. I would say, and going back to this slide, is I would map that out. I would say, okay, if we achieve X, we can roll into Y and ultimately Z. And you probably need to leave that optional from the perspective of the customer. The other thing, keep open-minded as you're developing sort of that pilot framework with a customer, because there have been several instances when I've got into it and the customer realizes two things. One is, geez, this company I'm dealing with, I really like them and I can see how they're going to help us. And two is, why are we investing just in a pilot? We might as well just roll this out fully, or even more than just the initial pilot. So I would definitely keep that in mind as you go through the pilot with your organization. And you're right, like some key metrics on where else could we go, how this would look. Like ultimately, it would be great is if you could define, here's a complete rollout, and then let's just start with the pilot. That's a very successful tactic too.
All right. I believe that is all of the questions that we have. Once again, John, thank you so much for spending some time this afternoon to go through the presentation with all of us. We really appreciate it. So thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure.
And for all of you who are joining us, the presentation has been recorded. We will be sending out the deck and the presentation to all of you a little bit later today or tomorrow. But with that said, once again, John, thank you so much for joining us. For all of you who participated in our live chat or have watched and viewed this later on in the future, thank you once again for joining us. We hope all of you have learned valuable kind of lessons and skills in terms of how to approach pilots and proof of concepts, especially with enterprise customers, thanks to John's expertise. So enjoy the rest of the day, everybody. Take care, stay safe, and we will be back tomorrow with some more workshops. And John, once again, thank you.
Thank you. Bye now.